So I thought I will do some cylinders. So cat, this is a demonstration. And yeah, deal with some rims. I was reminded of the subject by Ben this morning. Yeah, because you do rims for lots of different reasons, and I was saying about those ramen bowls where you tend to end up with some juice in it that you want to drink well, and you want a rim that you can put to your lips rather than something that's very flat. So the rim has a practical point of view from the finished pot. It also has a practical point of view. I think I was saying to somebody yesterday about with the raw glazing, particularly if you're just raw glazing things on the inside. The inside of the pot, of the dry pot, expands with the water being absorbed out of the glaze, and if you have a thickened rim, that holds the pot together. If you've got a thin rim, that expansion isn't contained, and you can get pots splitting. The other thing was boxing pots, as it's called. That's where you've got two bowls and you put them together, so you can stack them in the kiln and then you put two more on top of them. It's called boxing. Obviously when you're having to box pots, you're not going to put a very thin rim to another one. You want a fatter rim, and maybe even a flattened rim, so that they'll go together. I don't think we've got one of those French milk jugs in here. I get one at coffee time. So that the rim is serving a purpose when it comes to stacking in the pots, so that has to be designed in. And then the look of it is another factor again. So yeah, the difference here is when you've got to the bottom is that you then carry on out to make the floor of your pot. Whereas on a bowlray there's no floor. The wall starts and the centering goes right out to the rim. On a cylinder, the floor to the pot. And before I lift the wall up, I use the side of my thumb to go from the centre out to the rim there. It both compresses the clay and it smooths it, and you shouldn't be doing anything else with the floor once you're working on the walls. And then you're doing the same thing where you're pressing in on the clay, holding your fingers a certain distance apart and leading behind the wall of that thickness of that gap between your fingers.
So the outside edge of your floor is exactly the width of the pot?
Yes, often I make it just a little bit bigger, because when you've put your finger in there, you've got that rounded edge inside, which is a bit extra clay. If it's rounded like that, but as you thin the wall, you push it from the outside, you fold that over, and that thickness of clay disappears.
Right.
So again, you've made better use of the clay, got better weight to the pot. And then I do that thing with tidying it up with my thumb, which also gives me that groove to start right underneath the clay and come up. Now if you press on this wall as well as lift, the wall will get wider, it'll spread out. So to counter that, it's often a good idea to actually go in a little bit as you cut up.
And which finger is leading? Is it the inner finger?
Now when you're making just a cylinder, the two are opposite each other, pressed in, and then you go up.
But to stop it coming out?
Well, yes, if you're going in, then the outer finger is slightly over the inner finger, and it's the opposite if you're coming out. So again, I push that skirt in, start right at the bottom, and come up. And often there, when I'm coming up, I actually start with that finger pressing the bottom because it's simply lower to the clay, and then sort of move to that finger as you come up the wall. Okay. Yeah. I can use the side of my finger if I want to make that just that much flatter. So there I've stopped pushing it before I've got to the rim, so that I have left this thickened rim. And I was saying yesterday, if you want to visually make that a little bit more defined, I just do this business of putting my fingernail behind there. It just defines it a little bit more, casts that shadow. So there's a thickened rim. If quite a lot of the jugs that I make, I want to strengthen rim on them, so I then pinch them. Yeah, I'll put a bit of shape into this and then turn this into a little dumpy jug. So I'm going to come out. I'll make, I don't normally make necklace jugs, but I'll do one like that John Leach one that's sitting on the window ledge there. So just remove. So on jugs that have a thickened rim like this, what you have to do is to pinch out this rim. So that you've pinched the clay to about the same thickness that the wall or pot is. Then use the chamois leather to tidy up the slightly ragged edge that you've produced by the pinching. And then supporting that, use this sideways movement to spread the clay to make one pouring lip. Yep. If I make another jug but with a different lip on it, different rim, so in the initial push-up with those, I was just using that joint there rather than my fingertips, and they're variously. If I'm making a bigger pot, I often make the initial lift on the wrong side using this heel on my hand. You can apply pressure to kind of a large amount of clay and go up and then go back to working. So there's lots of.
Why do you do that then? Why do you do your opposite hand?
Because if you've got a big pot, you're having to lift a lot of clay. Actually having the clay coming against you provides a little more power to that lift.
And on the other side it's not against you?
No, the clay's going away from you.
Okay.
And
okay.
You're using these small pressure points. It's very difficult there to get
So
a large pressure point on the
yes,
clay.
I understand that side. Would it therefore, in theory, not be sensible to carry on that side?
No, because again, here you've just got this area against the clay. Lifting it. When it comes to throwing your fingers, you want the clay to be led through to that pressure point, not to be coming up against the pressure point.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because I was at a gathering of people on Saturday night where there were two engineers discussing electrifying a potter's wheel, where you have the little rubber wheel on the motor and it's coming down and touching the flywheel, and the different angle at which that wheel meets the flywheel. I was completely lost, but there's two different angles and a different way that it contacts the wheel. That's, you know, you've got these different angles of contact to the clay that make quite a bit of difference. So I'm going to make a jug here with the kind of rim that Michael Cardew used on his jugs. So he would leave extra on the top there.
How much clay did you start with there?
Just £1.5 pounds. I can't do the metric conversion, but the old rule was that a pound of clay would make a pint pot. Obviously, as it gets bigger, it gets the capacity gets greater. But
Pound makes a pint pot.
yeah,
That's very sanitary. I was thinking a pound would make half a pint, actually. By the time I've taken off the excess and bits have dropped off.
right. So what Cardew did was that he made this sort of triangular in form. And the other thing I should be saying, Jack, to you is when you're throwing cylinders, as much as you lift the clay so it's the right thickness, then you put the form in it. A, because it just is easier to thin a pot by going straight up. B, you can look down, you can have one eye on the inside, one eye on the eye, you can see the sort of thickness that you've got there. And then you put the form into it. Now, I think I've got my proportions a little bit wrong here. I've got a rather heavy rim for what I'm doing here. In Cardew, you can make it sort of great play with the form of a jug, whether it was a form that was sort of generous and giving, or whether it was a form that sort of contained. I think that is a good example, that John Leach jug that's there as a jug that sort of contains. Cardew's jugs, pretty much all of them, the rim would be just slightly wider than the base. So if you just looked at where there was a line from the base to the rim, it would be an outward feel. And that this added to the fact that this, you know, there was a feeling that this pot was there to pour out the liquid, rather than one that was sort of sitting there holding the liquid. I think on that one of John Leach's, the neck is still slightly wider, isn't it, than the base?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, it looks quite secretive, that one, doesn't it? Holding it all in.
So the idea on these is, and I haven't really got a page on here, that when you come to pull the lip from this, the inner edge becomes the outer edge. So you support it, and as you pull this,
So you don't do that initial pinching?
sorry?
You don't do that initial pinching that you did on that one?
No, No, the idea is not to distort the top, but what you're trying to do is to get a fairly sharp edge. Well, let's start earlier. A jug has the volume. It has this neck, which then leads in to the throat of the spout and then to the lip. And the aim really of that edge is that this curve of it makes for a good pour, but what you want this edge for is to cut off the flow when you stop pouring. And as with teapots or jugs, you have this like dilemma with pots that really the sharper this edge is, the better it'll cut off, but then the more likely it is to chip. So you want really, you know, a strong, sharp edge. And in fact, those the French jugs that I was thinking about, which I should pick all the time, they were mostly sort of used like pitchers. So you would go and get something in it. Like when I worked in France, I used to have to go with one of these jugs to the farm, get it full of milk. You came home and it was tipped into a saucepan to make that milky coffee that the French go in for in the morning. And it's just got a square edge on it. It still pours remarkably well. But yeah, and on these, that's quite a strong edge, whereas often on these ones, and I haven't done a good job on that one, because it's really not sharp. And the other thing is you've got to get the angle right. Often the mistake people make to begin with these jugs is when they pull this lip, they pull it too far, so it's much more on the horizontal. Which means when you pour, it's going to tuck back underneath one, and it has a long way to go before it cuts off the flow. So you want one that's more that sort of shape. When it pours, it's well over, but it hasn't got so far to go back and cut off the flow. And this one, really, again, they're thinking about what a rim is doing. This rim is out of proportion with the pot. You know, this is far wider and heavier than you want for a pot of that size, and that's really rather important. You see that rim and you think, oh, this is a very heavy pot because it's kind of not in scale with the body of the pot. Did I cut that off?